This morning, it's my pleasure to share with you the evolution of school counseling over the past 120 years. During those 120 years, three basic questions dominated the discussions in conferences, workshops, in articles, and in books. Who are school counselors? What do school counselors do? And what do they actually do? And interesting discussions went on, as we will see, over those 120 years relating to those three questions. In order to share the story, we need to go back to the beginning of the early 1900s. And appreciate with me, folks, that a lot was going on in our country during that period of time. Primarily the Industrial Revolution was changing the way people related to work. Many people were moving from farms to cities to towns and working in new industries, which required new kinds of skills. Education was changing in order to respond to those challenges. And so a lot was going on. And as we look at the origins of our field, we will see that it did not evolve in a vacuum. Many things were going on which influenced how the field developed. So as one writer said, we are a coat of many colors. And I thought that was a very interesting expression because it summed up all of the context and the influences that were impacting on the development of our field. Three things came up. The early leaders identified the kinds of things that they wanted to work on. Notice the first one: better prepare workers for the workplace. And you think about some of the challenges we face today, are we still concerned about that? Of course we are. And so that came out of the Industrial Revolution, and it also had an impact on education. Notice the second goal: helping students find purpose in their education as well as their employment. Again, are we concerned about that today? Yes, we are. So those first two goals are still goals that we have now in somewhat different ways. But look at the last one: change school methods and organization, and exert more control over conditions of labor in child employing industries. This was the first social justice issue for our profession: child labor. And it resulted in national legislation that required that young people have work permits in order to work in certain industries. We want to hang on to that point because you'll see it come back in just a moment. I wanted you to see this because it's a very interesting statement. Notice former president of Harvard University, and he had a presentation titled "The Value During Education of the Life-Career Motive." Very interesting expression. And notice what he was saying: that young people take no interest in school, no connection between their studies and means of learning a livelihood, drop out of school, and sometimes the parents are involved with that. And then notice his last point. He felt that students were to be successful, they needed purpose and direction in their lives. They needed the motive of the life career. Very interesting expression. And as you think about what we focus on today, we use the same kind of terminology. Now, there were some interesting contributors, and I wanted to share three names with you. The first one you may never have heard of: a man by the name of Lysander Richards. 1881, he wrote a book, small little volume, titled Vocational, The New Profession. Now notice the word vocational. He used that expression to describe this, and what he was going after was to have well-trained individuals in every community in the United States who were to help young people find purpose and direction in their lives. Now, he chose a very interesting word to describe those people. He called them vocifers. Now, had his ideas prevailed, Sherry, we would have the Missouri School Vocifer Association. And I'm rather pleased that his ideas didn't prevail, but he started this, and it's 1881. Now, the name you're probably familiar with is the one in the middle, Frank Parsons. And of course, you know, he had a clinic in the Civic Service House in Boston, and he did counseling with individuals, both young people and adults. He was the first one to coin the word vocational guidance in a report that he wrote about the work that was going on. At the same time, you remember in Europe, there was a heavy interest on developing new tests, psychometrics. And a man by the name of Hugo Musterberger came from Germany and landed in Harvard and set up a clinic. And Frank Parsons used that clinic to help test some of his clients. So assessment now becomes part of the picture, as we will see, and it continues. The last one you may not know either. This was Jesse B. Davis. He was a principal in a high school in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And he wrote a book in 1914 titled Vocational and Moral Guidance. Interesting combination of words, vocational and moral guidance. And in it, he described a curriculum for guidance beginning in grade 7 through grade 12. And so the idea was this would be taught in the schools. But remember, no counselors. We had teachers and administrators. And in fact, he saw the job of doing this curriculum as a job of administration. And administrators were to do this work. Now, it's interesting, later on, there was an article written about that issue, and one person wrote, you know, there are some administrators are so busy doing guidance that they have little time for administration. Very interesting expression in light of how we reverse that in terms of school counselors sometimes. Jesse B. Davis went on to make some substantial contributions, as we will see, in the field. Now, also appreciate something else. There was what was called a progressive movement. And notice vocational education, that was the original term, career and technical education today, and vocational guidance were seen as twin reform movements to education. Notice the elevation of guidance now, along with career and technical education, to change education from being rather bookish, training of lawyers and doctors and so forth, to now being able to train new workers for the workplace as it was changing due to the Industrial Revolution. So, twin reform movements. What was the organizational framework for these folks? Remember, no trained counselors, no full-time people. Who were tapped? Administrators and teachers. And it was natural then to assign them duties because they already had their identity. They taught math or science or whatever it was, but then they would be asked to do some additional duties. Boston and a number of other communities began to identify teachers, maybe releasing them for an hour a day or so in order to do this kind of work. Now, you might be interested to see what were some of those duties. There were 15 reported in this particular article for vocational counselors in Boston in 1915. And notice you can see some of those tasks about being a representative, attend meetings, responsible for materials, occupational information, and working with branch librarians. Occupational information, by the way, was very key here in terms of the work that was going on. In addition, lessons in occupations, working with teachers, interviewing pupils, and then the cumulative record was a new tool that was developed, and so they were to use that. And then finally, making a careful study of grades 7 and 8, urge children to remain in school, conferences, and then notice, re-interview and check cards, obtaining work certificates. Remember in early, probably 1913, when Congress passed the issue around child labor. And work permits were part of that legislation. Now the question is, who was going to do that? Guess who got the job? Counselors, or people who were acting as counselors at that time. Kind of what we call today an unfunded mandate in terms of the requirements of carrying on this task. So immediately counselors did that. In fact, do some schools issue work permits yet today? Yes, they do. Yeah. And who does it? Counselors, yeah, interesting. Again, that duty kind of stayed with us over the years. Now, by the 1920s, you began to see, in addition to vocational guidance, many other things going on. And notice the first one, notice the phrase, mental hygiene. That was the common phrase at that time. In fact, when I first came to Missouri, we had a course on mental hygiene, now mental health. In the early 1900s, a man by the name of Clifford Beers wrote a book, The Mind That Found Itself. And it was his description of his trip through the issue of depression and being institutionalized. And that book began a whole process of mental health issues. And committees were formed and so forth, and that continued to be a major emphasis. Progressive education, the changing education, child development, and then the psychometric movement. Remember, coming out of Europe, Binet, Stanford Binet now, the individual intelligence testing, World War I, they had different tests being used to test the soldiers. And then the people coming out of World War I, the psychologists, began to develop all kinds of tests, assessment. And that's going to be with us, as we will see, as we continue. Now, I want to share a short article with you. A man by the name of George Myers. George Myers was a professor of vocational education at the University of Michigan. And he was really a very strong influence, as we will see, on our field as it grew and developed. This was, I want you to see, 1923. And I want to look at the words. He said there was a growing recognition that vocational guidance as an integral part of organized education. Notice the phrasing, integral part of education. Apart from education being wished upon the schools by a group of enthusiasts because there's no other place to put it. Really saying it's central. Then he goes on and says, this is key because it has to do with the budget, the plan of organization, administration, methods of carrying on the work, and then orderly, systematic progress in vocational guidance means that you have to deal with this fundamental conception. Notice the second point. Vocational guidance is recognized as a specialized educational function requiring natural qualifications and special training. Now, the issue of training comes into play because in the early 1900s, remember, teachers, vocational or administration people, where were they going to be trained? One of the first classes was held in Harvard University. And then gradually other institutions began to pick up and began to do some specialized training. There was no full-time people, but part-time people working, needing some training. And he's pointing out that special training was needed. And then notice this next point. There's appreciation, and then notice the phrasing, centralized, unified program of vocational guidance, school counseling as we call it today, for the entire school system is essential to the most effective work. He was one of the first people to use the word program. And he said it's very important. We're rapidly passing out of the stage where each high school and junior high school can do it as they see fit. Very interesting point. Then he adds another point. Notice what he's saying. This is dangerous because there's a tendency to load the vocational counselor with so many duties foreign to the office that little real counseling can be done. In order to prevent that, important that the counselor be well trained, the principal should understand more clearly what counseling involves, and that there be efficient supervision from a central office. All of this in about a 4-page article in 1923. And think of the words that he's been using, as we'll see they come into play as we develop later. Now, who was providing all of this? Say the 1910s to the 1930s. Teachers, administrators, social workers, and beginning of having some part-time counselors who were originally teachers. And that's an important point, as we will see too later, in terms of the training issue and the certification issues. By the time we reached the 1930s, they were struggling with trying to figure out, well, who are these people and what should they do? So they had some studies done, and a man by the name of Proctor in 1930 looked at the issue of establishing a preferred list of duties. And notice the phrasing he used at the end. They wanted to establish the standard setup for guidance, meaning they really wanted to know what the actual duties should be. So in the 1930s, they began that process. And then Myers, remember George Myers, 1923? He comes back again. And now he's looking at this list. And notice what he's saying again. There are 37 items on this list, and form a noble list, and obviously the many essential duties. But then notice the next phrase. Equally obvious that some of them are routine administrative or clerical duties that have nothing to do with counseling. Evidently, of setting up a program, some administrators have unloaded a large number of their duties on the counselor. It's interesting, by the way, if you have seen this issue of the school counselor, a very interesting article by Carolyn Stone that talks about that issue of other duties as assigned. So it's an issue, even beginning in the early years. Now, remember vocational guidance and then educational guidance, and now, beginning particularly in the 20s and into the 30s, all of the other issues, and so social emotional guidance begins to emerge. Now, hang on to those words, vocational, educational, social emotional guidance, because those phrases will come back to us too, as we will see as the field evolves. And so the issue of these many different issues beginning at this point in time. Now, by the time they reached the middle 30s, they're beginning to find that they had a whole variety of people doing this job. And so you had social workers, you had attendance workers, you had nurses, and so forth. And I guess some of the people said, well, they're all running loose in the school. What are we going to do to capture them, kind of pull them all together? And so George Myers, again, said, well, why don't we adopt what they use in industry, the idea of personnel. And so the issue of pupil personnel services emerged. And that became, as you will see, a very powerful organizational framework that we have been dealing with subsequently. And then a position within guidance services, and guidance services are part of pupil personnel services. So organizationally now, immediately we're cast within services, not instruction. And that has a lot to do with who we are too, as we will see. Now, what were the guidance services? Well, there were various lists. This is a typical list. 5 basic services. Notice what they are. And notice the first one, assessment. coming out of that psychometric movement that we were talking about. Information, occupational information, educational information, very, very key. Counseling, and that's a very interesting word there because we'll see something else occur later on. And then look at the last two, placement and follow-up. Are those part of our discussions today? Some, but they really come out of our connection to career and technical education, because in career and technical ed, placement and follow-up are very important. And so you'll see that connection back to that field, guidance and what we call vocational education, is very important. So those 5 services became the organizational structure. And in fact, when I started my program as a master's degree in 1958 at the University of Michigan, we had a textbook called The Guidance Services. And there was a chapter for each of these services that described what we were to learn in terms of carrying out the work of school counselors. Now, various titles. Remember, the question is, who are school counselors? Look at the titles for a moment that were being used. You find principals, vice principals, then deans. The 1930s saw an upswing of the word deans. And if you looked at the job description, it would have guidance work in it, but then discipline. And what is the connection of school counseling to discipline, for example? And as you see, if you had a dean, they were doing both discipline and what we would call guidance work today. And so the various titles. And so the whole issue of, well, what is the identity? If you've got all of these different titles, how do you know who you are? And that's a real question, as we will see as we're trying to answer today. By the time we move, oh, by the way, the 1930s saw, because of the Great Depression, a lot of things that had been occurring in the 20s were reduced because of the Great Depression, but it still continued within the schools, the work that had begun in the teens and the 20s and the 30s. Now, the war years, 41 to 45, and then a very interesting expression somebody used, we have a terminology tangle. And again, the various issues about, is it vocational guidance? Is it educational guidance? Is it personal social guidance? Counseling? Counselor, vocational counselor, personnel worker? Member of pupil personnel services? We were part of the pupil personnel services, so we were personnel kinds of people. Interesting. Now, in 1946, a very important piece of legislation was passed. It was called the George Barden Act. It was named after the 2 senators who sponsored it. And in it was the first time money became available for guidance in the schools. And I have a brief article that I'd like to distribute to you, written in 1948, that describes, I need a copy. Yeah, thank you. That describes what this act did. And I'd like you to look at that for just a moment, because it really describes how school counseling formed in the state of Missouri in the 1940s and the 50s. And it goes back to, actually, as you'll see in the lead paragraph, to 1938, when there was another piece of legislation, the George Dean Act, which provided monies for state supervision. But it wasn't until 1946 that we began to see the full impact of the vocational education legislation. And if you turn to the second page, if I can open it up. You will see what it provided for. The maintenance of state programs, supervision, training was very key, and salaries and necessary travel of counselors within the schools. So this was a piece of legislation that really started the ball rolling in the state of Missouri. And so we began to see state supervision, training, money available, and so forth. So the George Barden Act, now remember, this was career and technical education legislation, but it served as the stimulus for what happened in the state of Missouri. During this period of time, there was a heavy emphasis on, well, what should we require for training? Now remember who was doing a lot of the work, teachers and administrators. So it was natural to assume that if we're going to train school counselors, they had to be a teacher first. So teacher certification and experience. And remember in Missouri you had to have a teaching certificate and 2 years of teaching experience. How many states still require that, by the way? Are there any states that require teaching experience or teaching certificate? I think there are 1 or 2. I'm not sure. But essentially, over the years, that has been removed. There was a movement toward more standardization of training programs. They're beginning to try to figure out, well, what should be the coursework for these folks who are going to be counselors in the schools? And so you will find more and more universities, colleges were beginning to offer various training programs. Now, another piece of legislation that was even to have more impact on the field occurred in 1958, and it was called the National Defense Education Act. I want you to think of those words for a minute, National Defense Education Act. You know why that was passed? Anybody want to offer a guess? It had something to do with the Russians. They, again, they had set up into the sky a planet, or what do you call it, a Sputnik, they call it Sputnik, and it circled the globe, and Congress in its wisdom said, uh-oh, we're behind. And we need to get more science and education and people trained in engineering and so forth. And the problem was, they said, well, who's going to help young people make those choices? We don't have anybody. And so in Title V of this particular piece of legislation, they established institutes to train school counselors. In 1959-60, I was a graduate assistant in one of the first NDA institutes in the country. One was at Michigan and one was at Columbia University in New York. And who was being asked to come to be trained? Primarily teachers and administrators. By the way, during that period of time, you know the name Ed Ayler?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, Ed Ayler. Yeah, Ed Ayler was a supervisor of guidance, but prior to that, he had been a band director in southeast Missouri. And he was a participant in this institute where I was a graduate student. So I had a chance to meet Ed at that period of time, and then when I came here, of course, by that time, he was part of the state supervision. Interesting. Now, the training, the impact of Carl Rogers. I can't tell you how much impact this particular theory had. Now, remember, teachers and administrators primarily. So what do you think they wanted to concentrate on in terms of training? They knew about education. They came out of the field. They knew about organizations and schools and so forth. But what they didn't have was counseling skills. So you will find in the NDA institutes a heavy emphasis on counseling skills, but it wasn't just any old counseling, it was Carl Rogers. And the phrasing was directive, non-directive, and so Carl Rogers' work was called non-directive. Now, you think of that expression for a moment. So we're training you in non-directive counseling. What do you think the public has an image of when they hear non-directive? Well, even the word had a problem. But nevertheless, this was a major emphasis. That doesn't mean other theories weren't being talked about. Adlerian, for example, was prevalent at that time, and others too, but Carl Rogers tended to dominate in terms of the issues. Now, okay, we're going to train people. We're going to put them in the schools. Where do you put them? There are no offices because schools were set up for other purposes. So physical facilities became a problem. And I remember coming into the field, the issue was, well, we'll put them in the closet. No, we'll put them on the stage. We'll put them under the staircase. So we're trying to figure out different spaces for school counseling. Now, keep in mind the issue of we're now in pupil personnel services, and we are focusing on counseling. So if you think about the organization of an office space, you tend to find office space with a place to drop in, and there's a secretary or somebody in some places, and then cubicles off of that. And where do you see that particular structure in other places? In doctors' offices. So it's interesting, the structure that was chosen had some implication for practice. Elementary school counseling. This was a time when this particular part of our field started and grew and developed, and it becomes the growth area, continuing in terms of school counseling today. Now, it doesn't mean there wasn't some effort early on, but it was the 1960s you began to see a major emphasis. 1954, American School Counselor Association was formed within the American Personnel and Guidance Association. Again, think of that expression, American Personnel and Guidance Association. They were first formed, by the way, as a part of APA, American Psychological Association, and they chose the name Professional Guidance Association, PGA. Who else has that title? Yeah, and so they had to worry about that, and they were challenged, so they changed the name and became the American Personnel and Guidance Association. Now, notice the trend, by the way, because the next title was American Association for Counseling and Development, AACD. And what is it today? The American Counseling Association. Notice the elevation of the word counseling. Very interesting point in terms of our profession. And remember, ASCA was a part of that, but they have pulled away and now have their own organization. And there were some reasons for that in terms of where the organization was going originally. If there was one article in the 50s and 60s on what is the role and function of school counselors, there were 1,000 articles. And people were trying to figure out what should be the actual role and the functions. By the time we reached the 1970s, it became apparent, going back to George Myers now in 1923, picking up on the idea we needed a vocabulary and a frame of thinking that could unify school counseling across all grade levels and school buildings. We needed the structure of a comprehensive program. Two brothers wrote a book some years ago now, and it dealt with why do some ideas prevail and others fail. And one of the things they came up with is if an idea is to prevail, it needed to have common language. And if you stop and think for a moment, that's what we have needed, common language, because we have searched for the role and function, we have looked under here or looked over there, and now we begin to see if we got common language. And so ASCA came up with a perfect phrase. And notice what it is. One vision, one voice. Now, please don't misunderstand. I don't believe they meant to say one vision, one voice meaning you had to say the same words, but it was the framework that became common language. And then within that, there was room to meet needs in schools and districts and so forth in different ways. Now, I want you to look at some words with me from the dictionary because they're very interesting. Notice the phrase position, a place occupied, the role a person has in an organization. A place occupied, the role. Then what's a role? Well, customary functions, duties that someone has or expected to have. Remember, that goes back to the probably teens, the position of the school counselor, list of duties. And I remember, if you look at list of duties, some had reached 29, 30 duties. And remember some of the discussion by George Myers and others about that. Now, I want you to look at this word. And notice the word program. This is a definition, a planned, coordinated group of activities and processes for a specific purpose. Let me go back. Look at those two words for a moment. Now look at this word. Is there a difference? Absolutely. And of course, the evolution of our field, as you noted in the title of my presentation, the subtitle is From Position to Program. And the whole idea behind this is to form a unified program of common language so that we have an understanding. We within the field and people outside of the field know and appreciate what it is. Now, 1980s and the 90s, a lot of different issues. Educational reform was going on. There was a publication, some of you may remember, A Nation at Risk. Various social forces, social problems, and then economic problems and issues. And again, those all were having an impact on the direction of our field, where we should go, what we should do. By the time at that period of time, I believe the field said it's time to look at the program approach as a major way to organize our field. And school counseling curriculum received attention. And remember the words vocational, educational, and social emotional? There were types of guidance. They now have become labels for the content areas of the field. Very interesting switch in how things are now phrased. But they stayed with us in terms of changing the language. Still debates about role and function. Human development specialist, change agent. Do we coordinate? Do we consult? Is that our major role? Or are we direct providers of services? What about indirect? Again, you get into the discussion of what's the direction. Remember, who are school counselors and what do they do? It's still with us, even with the program approach. And then notice elementary school counselors. Again, the growth area of the field. 2003, American School Counselor Association published the national model. Work began on that in the early part of that decade, 2001. I remember participating in a meeting in Tucson, Arizona, with Trish Hatch and, Sherry, pardon?
Judy Bowers.
Yeah, Judy Bowers, along with others, were at the table. And the whole idea was, should ASCA, for example, come out with something, now we call it the national model. And out of those discussions, and later ones in Chicago and other periods of time, the national model, and the idea of one vision, one voice became very important. And then, of course, the focus of the program. What should it emphasize? Academic achievement, should it do that? The answer is yes. What about mental health? And the answer is yes. And what about career development? And the answer is yes. Would it be easier if we selected one of those? Maybe. But now we have those three areas that we say school counseling program emphasizes: academic achievement, social emotional issues, and career development. And that's all embodied within the framework of the program. But again, the debate continues because of the issue of how much time do you devote to this or to that? Very interesting, by the way, as you think about the development of a program concept. There are many early efforts to develop a program idea. But interestingly enough, most of them forgot to add time to the equation. And it's very nice to list a variety of things, but if you didn't look at time, then you ran into immediate problems of when to do something, when not to do something, and so forth. And so the whole idea of our program approach is we added the dimension of time to look at in terms of planning what one was to do over a school year. Now, we know lots of demands and issues of, can you really do that? And the answer is yes, you can, but you also know that there are times when you have to change things and modify them and so forth. But it doesn't mean you abandon the idea of the program, my opinion at least. So, standards for the preparation of school counselors. Now we are in a debate. And notice the two individual groups, ASCA and CACREP. Very interesting. And of course now the issue of 60 hours for training. And does that fit school counseling? And there's a lot of debate going on about that right now, and people are even who have CACREP programs are wondering whether they can stay with the 60 hours. I don't know where that's going to go. That'll be interesting to see. Those of you who are counselor educators, you're dealing with that issue today. But you begin to see differences of opinion about the direction school counseling should go. Very interesting. I want to share one discussion that went on about that issue in the 1960s. This was a discussion between a counseling psychologist and a school counselor. And a man by the name of Larry Brammer, in an article, wrote the following. Brammer stated the field, school counseling, should drop the guidance model and adopt the counseling psychologist model for school counseling. Where will school counselors play ball? I have suggested the counseling psychology ballpark, not as an ideal solution, but as the possibility more compatible with the evolving school counseling functions. That was the counseling psychologist. Here is Joe Felix, the school counselor. Joe happened to be editor of the School Counseling Journal at the time, and he disagreed sharply. He strongly defended the guidance model, and he said the following: we have let some psychologists come into our park, even though their place is not really suited to the game at which they excel. They have put down the floor they brought with them. Now they want us to change the way we train and practice, and even the name of our team. Next thing you know, they will want to rename the park. It's amazing some of the discussion that was going on, very interesting. And this was that issue of, are we psychologists or are we school counselors? And we've got that issue today in terms of what do we emphasize? Can we do all three? Do we have to focus specifically on one or the other? And again, that issue. And as you know, ASCA simply said they did not agree with CACREP. in terms of how they laid out the requirements for school counseling. They essentially adopted the model, as some of you know if you look at what they have described, as the same format that they use for clinical people and so forth. And as you know, ASCA said no, they have their own standards. So we've got some issues here in terms of direction of the field and where we're going to go in terms of the next steps. So I'm glad to let some of the counselor educators now tackle that problem. I'm going to be on the golf course. I'll be thinking about you. Now, what about the future? So where do we go? And the question is, no question that the evolution of school counseling will continue. Remember the word evolution? It isn't just a description of the history. It describes how school counseling has changed over the years to have an impact in terms of the work that we do. And so we know social, economic, and academic forces will impact the transformation process. But in my opinion, I believe the program concept will continue, at least in the near future. Again, you'll have to decide on that as you work in the field and continue to work. But it's the whole issue of, you know, what should we emphasize and how should we proceed? And I guess if you had to say, what is the problem we have today? It's the implementation gap. It's kind of like saying, we know what to do, but now how do we get it done? And how do we close it in terms of getting all school districts to organize around that common language so that we have a unified approach across the state of Missouri? We have some real barriers to overcome. We have tradition, and tradition, remember, is very strong. It's the position orientation. And the position orientation means a list of duties. I saw one recently, and there were about 15 or 16 duties. And if you read down them, you started out with various things. You came to duty number 7, and it was to organize and implement a school counseling program. Now, notice it was number 7. It wasn't the duty, it was another duty. And I think sometimes we think about, well, doing a program, that's another duty we have to do. No, folks, it is the duty. And that's a point we need to make very clearly with our colleagues in school counseling, in administration, in teaching, and other settings. And the reason for that is, this is the way to focus the attention of our practitioners on the important work of working with each and every student in terms of student success. So that whole issue, we need to overcome tradition. And it weighs heavily on us because it comes out of the past, as we know. And so it's something, we know what school counselors do. There's a list of duties. I saw one once that had 29 duties. And as you know, the common expression at the end is, and other duties as assigned from time to time. And again, this article that Carolyn Stone wrote in here is a very good one that describes some of the issues involved and some of the other duties, etc. And we have made, as I know, some steps to change that too in the state of Missouri in terms of some of those other duties. Now, I grew up in the state of Wisconsin, and we lived in a small farming community, and dairy cattle were the primary focus. And I learned very early that if you wanted milk, you didn't go into the middle of a pasture and wait for a cow to back up to you. In fact, going into the pasture with cows is rather dangerous because they're faster than you think. And so that whole issue of how do we proceed. And so the point of this is to say, we don't wait. We need to take action now. And you stop and think about it. We need our heads to work on this, we need our hearts, and we need our hands. And some people using our hearts say, well, yeah, but we have so many problems. We got to deal with so many things. So I would offer this advice. You can visit Pity City, but you can't live there. So sometimes we need a chance to share our concerns and issues, no question. But we can't dwell on it because we have the vision, we have the voice, and it is the comprehensive program that will help us. But it does relate to training. We've got issues around that, as we know. It has to do with practice. It has to do with our communication with others in our communities, within our schools, and so forth, about who we are. Remember those 3 questions? Who are school counselors? What do they do? What should they do? Dominated our discussion over the years. And now we are at a point, I believe, where we have some answers. And we now have legislation that clearly identifies we are school counselors. And that is very important for us.